Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome everybody as you join the webinar. Welcome. We'll be starting in just a few minutes' time. As you join the event, please take a moment to fill out the poll that will appear on your screen shortly in front of you, and we'll share the results of that poll fairly soon. Please also take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat box if you wouldn't mind. We'd really love to know who you are and where you're calling in from. Welcome, and as I say, please fill in the poll on the screen in front of you. The first question there: what level of familiarity do you have with O&M of WASH infrastructure? And the second question: do you have any experience working on rural water supply payments, cost recovery, or other financial issues? So welcome if you're just joining us. Welcome to this webinar. We'll be starting in just a few minutes' time. And while we wait to start, if you wouldn't mind filling in the poll questions that appear on the screen there in front of you to do with your level of familiarity with O&M of WASH infrastructure, and also a little more technical, your experience, if you have any, working on rural water supply payments, cost recovery, or other financial issues. And as I say, please take a moment as well to introduce yourself in the chat box. We'd love to know who you are and where you're calling in from. A warm welcome if you're just joining us, and we'll be starting in a minute or two. Welcome to this webinar, everybody. Welcome if you've just joined us. Please take a moment to fill in the poll questions on the screen in front of you. We'll be starting in just a minute or two. And please also introduce yourselves in the chat box below at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'd love to know who you are and what part of the world you're calling in from. And good day, good morning, good afternoon to you, and welcome to the webinar. We'll be starting in just a minute or two. And if you haven't done so, please take a second to fill in that poll question in front of you on your level of familiarity with O&M of WASH infrastructure, the first question, and the second question there: do you have any experience working on rural water supply payments, cost recovery, or other financial issues? And we'll be getting started in just a second or two. Please also fill in your name, if you wouldn't mind, your name and where you're calling in from in the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Thank you. And some interesting poll results coming up there on those two questions. A mix of things. The first question on what level of familiarity do you have with O&M of WASH infrastructure, we have a really nice broad mix of folks there, from some people who have very little experience on O&M, they don't work in it at the moment but are interested in it, occasionally working on it, probably about a third of folks, and then more familiar with O&M or a major part of O&M work, roughly speaking 40% of people there. So thank you very much for filling that in. On the second question, on the more sort of in-depth experience with rural water supply payments, cost recovery, or other financial issues, most people have a little experience with that, roughly 60% of folks, some with a lot of experience and some with no experience at all. So if this is interesting to you, you've come to exactly the right place today. Welcome to this webinar. This is the 6th webinar of ProWASH's Operation and Maintenance of WASH Infrastructure series. My name is Jude Cobbing, and I'm the Senior Specialist for Water Infrastructure and Governance on the ProWASH Award. A special welcome to those French speakers who are tuning in today. We'd like everybody to be aware that we're providing French interpretation of this event. If you'd like to follow the event in French, please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select French from that. That's on the bottom right of your Zoom screen. Once you've selected French, you can choose to mute the original audio, or you can hear it in the background at a lower volume. We'll also be sharing the French version of the presentation in the chat box, so you'll be able to download that French presentation and follow it in the chat box if you wish to follow that in French. Now, if you have any technical issues during the webinar, please send a chat message to Suzanne Prowash, who you'll see in the chat box, and we'll do our best to assist you during the webinar. For those of you who are not familiar with ProWash, ProWash is an initiative funded by USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, BHA, and led by Save the Children. ProWash aims to provide support to implementing partners in order to strengthen the quality of WASH interventions through capacity strengthening, knowledge sharing, and applied WASH research opportunities. To learn more, you can visit the FSN Network website by clicking the link, which you'll find in the chat box as well. And if you haven't already done so, please introduce yourselves in the chat box. I would be really interested to know where it is you're calling in from and who you are. Also note, any questions that you have during the webinar, please post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So not in the chat box, please put any questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. All the questions will be answered after the webinar, after the speaker has finished presenting. And but if there are any that we don't get to, they'll be included in a questions and answer document, which we'll be sharing on the FSN website after the webinar is finished. And don't forget, you can also upvote questions in the Q&A box that you'd really like us to answer during the webinar. So welcome everybody. And to begin, I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Dr. Duncan McNichol is the director and co-founder of UPTIME, an international consortium developing results-based funding models for rural water maintenance services. Duncan has nearly 10 years of WASH experience in Africa, Asia, and South America, where he has directed governance programs, managed professional rural water maintenance services, and led academic research. Dr. McNichol holds a PhD in engineering from Cambridge University's Center for Sustainable Development, and he's based in Zanzibar, Tanzania. Duncan, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jude, and for the kind introduction, and to all of you for making time in your busy schedules to join us from around the world. As Jude mentioned, I'm calling in from Zanzibar, Tanzania. I'll apologize in advance for any commotion or noise in the background. I'm calling from a health center, so I have backup internet and power in case we have any issues. Of all the days to talk on a webinar about reliability, is the day where I have water access issues and power issues at home myself. So it's an issue that's near and dear to my heart, both personally and professionally today. And today I'll be talking on behalf of the UPTIME Consortium, this group of service providers and Oxford University, about the work that we're doing to try and ensure resilient rural water services for 100 million people by scaling reliability through results-based contracts. Next, please. And I'll start by framing the problem a little bit. I'm sure these are issues that many of you are familiar with. And anyone who tuned into the webinar last week, or not last week, the week before with Alan McDonald will have extra context to this. The problem I want to talk about is one of reliability. And that is that investments in rural infrastructure need to deliver long-term resilient services. Access is one thing, but those investments in infrastructure need to deliver on what they were designed to do. And there's a huge body of evidence behind this. On the left, we have some work from colleagues at Oxford, from Kitui County in Kenya. What this is showing is that over time, these piped services this piped infrastructure is less likely to be functional. From the previous webinar in this series, Alan McDonald talked about the hidden crisis. How is water flowing is just a really basic understanding of functionality. There are other things nested within this. Is there sufficient quantity? What's the reliability of it? And importantly, is that working when you need it most? As we look at the Sustainable Development Goal and getting towards universal services, not just access, these are the issues that we have to embrace, and we have to do so at scale if we're really to leave no one behind. Next, please. And that leads us to the financing problem. where we recognize there is a need for targeted resources specifically for operation and maintenance. And again, there's quite a bit of work behind this, looking at forecasts on what will it cost to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal. We see here a forecast that, yes, there still needs to be investment, there still needs to be new infrastructure, but equally, that has to be matched by an increase in resources for operation and maintenance. So that's both new investment, but also using what's there more effectively. How can we take these resources and use them strategically to ensure that this infrastructure delivers on what it was designed to do? And there's some urgency to this, since the recent JMP report shows that we're well on our way towards the SDG deadline of 2030, and we're not on track. So we need to address this problem, and we need to do this somehow at scale. Next, please. This was the genesis of the UPTIME group, which began with a number of service providers working in different parts of Africa. At the time, I was the general manager of WAVE in Uganda, managing a maintenance program for rural hand pumps. And collectively with Oxford University, we all recognized different aspects of this problem, that there needed to be some way to focus resources towards rural maintenance at scale, and to do so in a strategic way. And so we thought we'd get together first to share data and see if, based on our experiences and the information we had, if we could create an investment case. And we came together, and first, these are all different service models. So for example, Water for Good, or Water Mission, who's joined us on the call today, works primarily with pipe services. WAVE was working with hand pumps. Uduma is a private company that's maintaining infrastructure in Burkina Faso and Mali. There were all different types of services within this. But what they had in common is that they were doing maintenance work. It was really reliable, the infrastructure they were maintaining. And importantly, users were paying some portion of the service cost. And so we thought, okay, there's some commonality to this, even though it's different countries, it's different service models. Maybe there are some key indicators we can pick out from this that can provide an overall picture of the service, its performance, and an investment case. Next, please. And the initial work found that we could do this at some level. If we looked at a high level of some key indicators, looking here at the number of infrastructure maintained, we found that overall these 5 organizations in 4 countries were maintaining close to 3,000 water points, mixture of piped and hand pumps. Overall, we estimate it was about 1.2 million people were accessing these services. And importantly, to the reliability question, this infrastructure was functional approximately 94% of the time. And this is uptime. This is the proportion of time the infrastructure is working as a key metric. So it's importantly, not just is it working, but is it working either all the time or it's fixed quickly when it breaks. That's the scale and the operational performance. And then the financial performance, we looked at what users are paying for this service and how does that inform an investment case. And we found that overall, this is users are paying on aggregate approximately 30% of the total service cost, which is great that this demonstrates their value towards the service. This helps to recover some of the operational cost. But our ideas of pitching this as an opportunity for impact investment or blended finance were something we had to recalibrate when we looked at the gap between the cost and what users are paying for these services. Next, please. And so we had to reframe our understanding of the problem by recognizing that not all of these rural services are currently profitable. And if we look at getting towards universal services where everyone has reliable and resilient water access all the time, we conceptualize this with the figure you see here, that some level of non-repayable funding is needed to achieve universal services. In some areas where you have the right technology, where you have the right demographics, the right infrastructure, the right institutional context and things like that, those things can come together to absolutely create a service where tariffs alone can cover the service cost. And in those cases, commercial finance might be possible. These services could get investment and could scale and be financially sustainable just from local revenue. As we move out into harder to reach areas, into more difficult contexts, into fragile contexts, we start seeing areas where some level of non-repayable funding will be necessary if we're to ensure that the service can continue functioning. Even if users are paying part of that, it might not be the full cost recovery. And you can read more about this analysis and how we framed this problem in the working paper at the link below. What we were left with was this question: how can targeted, transparent, and ideally results-based funding catalyze resilient services at scale? So we know that there's this gap, there's this need for results-based funding. How do we be smart about that? How do we data-driven, scalable, try and minimize that over time, find some way to address this problem systemically that can make a difference towards the SDG target? Next. And so this was our challenge problem. How might we design results-based contracts that issue non-repayable funding to ensure resilient water services at scale? So for 100 million people by 2030. And this is the crux of what we've been trying to work on as a group for the past, well, coming up on 3 years now. And next. And the first version of what we came up with, we documented in our working paper that came out last year, these results-based contracts for rural water services, where we took what data we had from these service providers, we tried to boil that down to a few key indicators, and then to structure that in a way where we could get results, calculate a payment, and issue non-repayable funding to service providers, and use the same approach for all of these services, despite their different context service models, something that was simple and some transparent and something that could be scalable, even though there's a lot of variation between these services. Basically, we didn't want to make something that was tailored to each individual context because we didn't want to create a pilot that would not fail, but also might not scale. Next, please. And what we came up with is something we called the UPTIME framework that is the core of these results-based contracts. And this looks at 3 key performance metrics that we combine to calculate results-based payments. The first KPI is reliable water points. This is the quantity of infrastructure that works reliably. Next. The second piece is the water volume. So is that infrastructure actually being used? Is it producing water as it's expected to? Next. And the third piece is a financial component, looking at local revenue. And we deliberately called this local revenue rather than just tariffs because we wanted to recognize that domestic sources of funding, not just from water users, but equally from institutions, so schools or health centers, or potentially from local government, can also be legitimate and sustainable sources of funding for these services. And we wanted to include that in this model. Together, we felt that this takes into account, oh, not quite yet. Sorry. This takes into account the scale, the reliability, the use, and critically, the perceived user value of these services. All right, next. Great. We published the working paper last year, and then we felt, you know, these ideas look good on paper, but it's easy for ideas to look good on paper. What we need to do, we need to get out there into the real world and we need to test this. And what we did was we launched a charity last year called the UPTIME Catalyst Facility in order to test the scalable results-based contract with this group of service providers. We incorporated this as a UK charity, October 2020. We set up these results-based contracts with the group of service providers in the UPTIME consortium, the 5 you see there. And we're lucky enough to be backed by an equally excellent group of funders who are excited about this mission and who have supported the UPTIME Catalyst Facility for its first year. And then we're now transitioning to multi-year engagements with several of them. The way this works is first, the service providers do the work. So they bear the operational risk. After that, they report their results to the UPTIME Catalyst Facility. Those results are confirmed. And then once the data is confirmed, the service providers are paid in arrears for the results achieved. Importantly, what this does is this shifts the risk profile from the funder to the service provider. So we can turn around to the funders and say, the resources we're asking for, these are only for verifiable results rather than funding up front for services and reporting later. And if you'd like to see more about that, you can check out the website for the Catalyst facility at the link below. Next. You can also see the results directly. One of the things that we've built to make the UPTIME Catalyst facility work and these contracts work is we've built a web application at uptimewater.com. And what this does is aggregates the data from the service provider, and then it automatically produces the performance summaries and the results-based payments. From this, the global dashboard is the public part. And here you can see how the results-based payment then combined with what users are paying to help meet those operational costs and then keep these services continuing at this level. These are the public results, and what we found from the first set of we've issued 2 payments now, so you can see Q4 2020 and Q1 2021. And what you can see is the scale of services delivered, and on aggregate, it seems we're on track to be issuing an annualized payment of less than $1 per person per year. Next. And then on the inside of the web application is the part that the service providers can access, and also the trustees of the Catalyst facility can access to see a more detailed breakdown of the service performance and then automated payment calculations estimates that are generated from the results. Here we can see the financial performance. And next. As well as details of the operational performance. So what are users paying for this? Where are the water points? Which ones are working? Which ones have an uptime of greater than 96%? And even though the service providers self-report this data, because it's under this results-based contracting model, there's a legal obligation for them to sign off on the accuracy and the completeness of this data, which we also then validate by checking against historical records from themselves and others. Next. Great. So far, so good. The first set of contracts, we're still learning a lot from this, and we're still updating the contract model as we go. We have a new working paper coming out later this month that I'll encourage you to access, and that'll explain some of the changes that we've made since the first batch of contracts, but still really focused on those 3 key performance indicators in the UPTIME framework. The other thing we've been able to do is, with support from one of our funders, who was able to make available some more resources, we were to scale up. So the question was, if you had increased funding this year, could you expand to more countries? And because of the way we've structured the data systems and the contract model, we had data from our partners in Mali, Tanzania, and Malawi. And so not quite overnight, but very quickly, we've been able to scale this up now to 7 countries. So we're now in Mali, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and Malawi, with services serving a total of about 1.5 million people. Next. Implications, what we've learned so far. The 3 points I want to highlight, the first is that by really trying to focus on a simple results-based contract design, we think we have something that can be scaled across different contexts and service models. Now, we're still testing that. We're still working with a fairly small group of trusted service providers, but it does seem like this is the type of thing that we could either directly apply elsewhere or be able to adapt somewhat minimally to then reach larger scales. And to the second point, that's been made possible by a focus on some really key performance indicators, which then simplifies the reporting and the verification system. As we have it now, the only 2 metrics that that require verification are the amount of revenue generated and time-stamped data on the use of the infrastructure. So something like a data logger or a volumetric flow meter with a timestamp. Those are the two components needed to underpin a verification system for this contract model, which is still a challenge in many areas, but we think a manageable challenge to address in a variety of contexts. And then finally, just to emphasize how this payment following results reduces the risks to funders. We've run into some scenarios where there have been data gaps where we haven't been able to understand what level of service has been delivered in certain areas. And so in those instances, we're able to show to funders that genuinely what they're paying for are the results that we can confirm, that we can directly see and have confidence in. And so in that sense, your investment, in in these services is, the risk profile on that is really attractive. Next. All right. You may well be wondering, the title of this presentation was Services for 100 million. And so far I've talked about, 1.5 million. How are we going to bridge this gap? And that's where we're at as a group right now, is trying to understand how we can take what we've been developing with the Uptime Catalyst facility and then use that to create results at a much larger scale. And so if we take a step out, really what we're trying to develop is a platform for matching these resources to results at scale. Right now we're doing this with the Uptime Catalyst facility. And so there's some resources coming in, there's water users. So that doesn't go through the UCF, that goes to the services, but their water users are involved in paying for the service. There are partnerships with these philanthropies and foundations that are providing some of these resources, and the Catalyst facility can match these to results that include the metrics I showed you, but also these wider socioeconomic impacts of developing rural enterprises, reliable services for communities, schools, clinics, and then also opportunities for climate risk mitigation. At a basic level, if we want to scale this up, we can try and boost both sides of this equation. So we can try and find more services, and we can try and find more resources to match to those services, and we could do that through the Uptime Catalyst facility. Next. And to that end, we are doing work towards that. Some of you might have seen the global diagnostic that we're doing in partnership with REACH and RWSN. This was the 100 million survey where we asked, who else is out there? Who else is doing this work? Who's delivering services? Who has the data? Who could be eligible under this type of results-based arrangement? Next. I'll give you a quick sneak peek on that. The report will be coming out later next month. But suffice to say, we had a response from several hundred service providers and quite a strong government representation from all over the world, representing around 500,000 pumps and 3 million pipes water points. And so that's now giving us some more visibility on who else could come into these services, who's doing what where, and how could we create an opportunity for results-based funding to catalyze development of those services further. Next. And then the other piece that we're doing is a philanthropy market assessment with support from the Conrad and Hilton Foundation to understand that landscape of corporate and private philanthropy, to see to what extent, if we can show, here's a global pipeline of services that can generate results, does that appeal to new types of outcome funders who might make commitments of non-repayable funding in exchange for verified results? So can we boost both sides of that equation? Next. What we're learning through this process is that strategy of just finding service providers and matching it to, say, philanthropy, perhaps via the Uptime Catalyst facility, that's only going to get us so far. Right now, we have visibility through that 100 million survey on maybe services for approximately 5 million people globally. The question then is, how do we get beyond that? Because 5 million is a long way from 100 million. Next. And what we've begun to explore is, well, how can we take some of what we've learned, the contract model, the data systems, these types of processes, and make those available perhaps to governments, to regional governments or to national governments, in ways where they could adopt or adapt these systems to then reach much larger levels of scale. And so we're considering not just how do we look at what we're doing right now, how do we get bigger with the Uptime Catalyst facility? Yes, but how do we leverage that learning strategically so that these ideas that we're developing and testing can have a relevance beyond just directly where we're at today. Next. So I'll conclude just with a few points on what we're doing next and opportunities for engagement. I mentioned that, yes, we see opportunities to expand to a scale of services for approximately 5 million people. And so we'll be looking for resources to do so. We're most interested in tapping in as well to new sources of funding. So with philanthropy or non-repayable funding that maybe historically hasn't been attracted to the WASH sector because maybe they don't understand it or they don't see a clear opportunity. If we can draw in new funding commitments to support that scale, that would be really exciting. So that's an immediate priority. The other thing is looking at government involvement. So as I mentioned, if we're looking towards much bigger scale, where are there government partners we could work with at the subnational level or national level that could benefit from what we're doing? And we're looking for key windows of opportunity there. And then finally, for the service providers, thank you. I see several on the call who participated in the survey, so thank you for that. We are in the final stages of processing the data and look to have that report out soon. And I'd encourage any other service providers, if you think you might be eligible or like to participate in this model we're developing, please send me a note. We're always looking for where else there are groups that could participate. Next. And be on the lookout for our working paper, which should come out later this month, and the 100 million survey that will be coming out hopefully by end of October. And we'll be posting links to those on the Uptime website. Next. And I'll conclude with extending an enormous thank you to all of the people behind this. I have the pleasure of speaking with you today, but this is drawing on decades of experience from some incredibly talented people who've been working on these issues for a long time, and both within the Uptime Consortium and our group of funding partners who have been critical to not just in their support, but in their thought partnership to grow and advance this work. And that's it. We'll go to the next slide, which has my contact details. Oh, no, that'll come at the end. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Yeah, but we can put that up later. That's it. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to the questions.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you very much indeed for that very interesting presentation, essentially revolving around this key issue, which is that only around 30% of total costs are paid by users on average, which is that you're finding, and the rest of it needs to come from somewhere else. And those funders are obviously looking for results-based contracts or results to justify their investments, which you've based around your 3 points of reliable water points, proper water volumes, and some measure of local revenue. So thank you very much. It's really, really interesting. We've got some really interesting questions in the Q&A box. Please let me remind everybody, please put any questions you have for Duncan into the Q&A box. Now's your chance. Duncan, to get going with these questions, the first one here, when you talk about total costs, do you mean both CapEx and OpEx?
Great question. Thank you for asking this. We are specifically focused on the operating expenditure. So this is the operation and maintenance costs. Importantly, this is the total cash cost of that service. So this is both direct and indirect costs. That's your management fees and overheads and everything else on top of that, but not amortized depreciation or things like that. In many instances, in some areas, these service providers, they both develop the infrastructure and then maintain it. In many instances, they're also coming into existing infrastructure and trying to keep it work. So there's sort of a sunk capital cost in many of these areas, and then they're trying to keep a service going on top of that. So there's a real mix. But importantly, when I'm talking about cost recovery, when I'm talking about the level of subsidy needed, we're talking about infrastructure that exists, and we're looking at the financial sustainability of the operation and maintenance on top of that.
Gotcha. Thanks.
And importantly, it's important to recognize that then we're looking at this piece that might not be the full life cycle cost of the infrastructure. So if you factor in full depreciation, there might be additional things. Many of our service providers also do that as well. They include a provision, but again, it varies. In some cases, the service provider is responsible just for the O&M components, and then the life cycle replacement costs are borne perhaps by governments or another entity. So thank you. That's a really helpful clarification. I should have mentioned that.
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, really interesting question. Thank you. A next one here from Dick Tinsley around the number of people per service point. You mentioned there were 428 people per service point at one stage in the talk. And the question is, how much time is taken to obtain the water when serving that many people? And would there be a more optimal population per service point? Is that something that you touch on at all?
Right. So approximately for the piped water services, I think probably 40% of those are piped onto premises. So the collection time is on premises household access. Again, it depends with context. So rural Central African Republic is pretty sparse, and also our understanding of population is fuzzy at best. All the organizations try very hard to come up with good population estimates, but in some areas, I think in parts of Central African Republic, the community reports an estimate of 1,000 people, which sometimes the estimates just don't make sense. All of which is to say, it's quite difficult to know exactly how many people are accessing a water point. How many people are accessing a given water point really varies with context. And then in some of those areas, where there's a lot of demand or there's a lot of stress on a water point, when you have a continual service that can see that, it can monitor it, then that can inform a subsequent investment. And that's what Water for Good does, and that's exactly what they do in Central African Republic.
Great. Thanks, Duncan. And moving on to another question, Abdul Azam asks quite literally the $1 million question here, which, and you've spoken a bit about this already in the talk, but to recap, where do you get the money from the fund to fund the non-repayable funds for the O&M in rural areas? So in other words, that other 70% of funds, roughly who does that come from?
Right. At the minute, it comes from that group of funders whose logos I put up. You'll likely be familiar with many of those groups. They're a known group of supporters of the WASH sector who have been engaged in these issues for a long time. In many cases, they've directly supported some of these service providers in the past. I'd say, like, together they're a group of funders and service providers where we all have a vested interest in trying to solve this problem at a systemic level. I won't say that raising the first, or we've secured about $1.5 million for the first year, and then it looks like we'll be able to secure recurring funds, at least for this scale. I don't want to say that's the easy part, but it's the easier part with a group of people who are all committed, who all want to see this work in some way. The question now is, have we developed something compelling enough to attract new sources of funding that, even if they're non-repayable, could be sustainable? Because there is money out there looking for a home, where people say, they allocate funds for socioeconomic outcomes. And if we can link with that, then yeah, can we grow further? That's the question we're exploring now. But to date, it's that group of funders. So mostly foundations, private philanthropies, and GIZ has helped us with some with some funding from day one.
Great, thanks, Duncan. And obviously, compared to the cost of not providing services, which presumably is much higher, it's a good deal. So really interesting. Yeah, thank you. Question from Yadav Mainali: is results-based contract made with? This is around who the contract is made with. Is it made with the user group community or only made with the implementing partner organization? How exactly is that contract made?
Right. So the Uptime Catalyst facility contracts the service providers. So we have agreements with each of them, and sometimes separate agreements for different countries. But the Uptime Catalyst facility is a UK charity. It has three trustees and me. And we don't have a presence on the ground in Mali or Central African Republic where we could then go directly to literally hundreds of communities and establish these relationships. So really what we've done is we've pushed that to the service provider and included some requirements around, they have to have some agreement, for what the rules are, what the tariffs are. We have some things around affordability and around, some legitimacy to operate, a registration at the government level, so a registered company or something like that. But these are all, it's hard to be overly specific about those requirements because it varies with contexts, and in fragile contexts, it's harder to verify some of those relationships. But what the important thing for scale is that the Uptime Catalyst facility is able to run a really lean operation to support all these services through these contracts by working through the service providers. And yeah, then they maintain the relationships with governments, other institutions, and the communities in country.
I understand. Thanks, Duncan. Next question here also touches a little on this issue, which is around that 30% of the cost that users themselves pay. And the question is, how are local water users paying for water, and how is the volume being taken and payment recorded? Is this with a prepaid system, or just manual water delivery with a cash book maintained by service provider or other? And presumably also this is a large range of responses, but it'd be interesting to hear your views on that, Duncan.
Yeah, as it will be no surprise to you, it varies. And we're in, I'll just quickly mention that 100 million diagnostic report coming out next month. We've done some analysis on this from all of those responses globally to show, who's paying, how are they paying, how is it measured, and some breakdown of that, which I found really interesting to see how that landscape looks a bit more globally. In terms of these service providers, what we found is that there's two main avenues for revenue collection. One is the volumetric billing, which is almost all of the pipe services and some of the hand pump services where there's provision to do that. And then the other revenue model is the sort of maintenance subscription fee. Which is the type of thing I work with WAVE in Uganda. Communities would pay an annual fee. We do preventive maintenance and respond immediately in the event of a breakdown. What we've done in the updated contract design is we've restructured the payment calculation to then match these revenue models. So the first question is, how do you get paid? And then the results-based contract then tries to supplement that based on however that service is designed. From a revenue perspective. But broadly, yeah, it's volumetric where it's metered and people are charged for that, or it's a maintenance subscription per water point. And then the payment is still largely cash, especially in rural areas where there's even mobile network coverage issues, but we do see some chunk of prepaid services or mobile transactions, things like that. We also see that those services are typically associated with a higher revenue, although there's a bit of noise in that data because there's such a bias between most hand pumps aren't metered, so it's hard to know if you put a metering system on a hand pump, would that then generate a revenue bump? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could talk lots more about the different contexts and nuances, but yeah, hopefully that gives you an overview, and yeah, more to come in the next report where we'll show a bit of that breakdown globally.
Great, thank you, Duncan. And I'll emphasize that on the Uptime website, the literature is there and free to anybody to download, and there's some really interesting information there. Duncan, this next question you touched on already, but I'm very interested in this, and there's a little addendum that I have too. The question is, does the contract model offered by Uptime Catalyst provide for any risk finance for capital expenditure on infrastructural improvements or investments, or only O&M of existing infrastructure? And my little addendum is, I think you spoke that you were mostly focused on the O&M, but what about the capital investment? Who does that? Could you talk a little bit more about the capital versus O&M distinction in the funding?
Sure. The short answer, do we provide risk financing for CapEx? The short answer is no. The contract model we've set up is purely for that, ongoing quarterly operational cost. However, we don't tell the service providers what they can do with that money. That is a completely unrestricted funding tranche that they can then use however they see fit, because we're paying them for the results, not the activity. And so if the service provider wants to turn around and say, well, I want to take these resources and invest part of that in capital expenditure to upgrade the service, that's completely their prerogative. We're not trying to be prescriptive around service models or investment options. That's where we really are just paying for the results. But it highlights that, what we're designing here is just a piece of the puzzle. You still need these other aspects of financing. I think a question for us looking at things like potentially DFIs or governments investing in CapEx as well, could you include a piece of results-based contracts for operation and maintenance as a way to de-risk a capital investment that someone else is making? Are there ways that, what we have and what someone else wants to do could dovetail to make a more complete investment package in the life cycle costs of a service? I think so. But step one was, can we do a small and fairly narrowly defined thing well and at scale. So happy to talk more about that if you see opportunities for how this could link with other funding baskets.
Right. Thank you, Duncan. Thanks very much. And this next question changes tack a little bit, but something that I'm sure a lot of folks are interested in today. And that is, can you give some more examples of how you're validating the volume of water used in some of the rural environments? What are the data loggers using, if you're using data loggers? And is this also being applied for hand pumps? So the question around, how do you know how much water is coming out, and what are the different mechanisms for reporting that?
Yeah, great. So I think what we have a good understanding of now are the minimum requirements of what technologies meet this validation requirement. And that's because we know we need time-stamped use data of the infrastructure, and it doesn't have to be real time, which is really important because we're paying retroactively. A data logger where data are picked up, several months or at the end of the quarter and then transmitted, equally fine. It doesn't have to connect to, satellites or mobile networks or anything. And so what that's done is it's helped us to do more of an assessment of what are some of the options. Many of these organizations, I'll highlight Uduma, Fundifix, and Water Mission, have built some really sophisticated systems and their own in-house technologies to try and do this themselves. That goes, above and beyond what we need for the results-based contracts themselves. So things like an accelerometer on the hand pump of a hand pump handle to measure its use and then to transmit that. There's many more technologies for pipe services that's much easier, but the headache is still the rural hand pumps, because it's less common for them to be metered in the way that pipe services are. We are looking at a couple of other technologies. We're collaborating with Charity Water to test their new Indian Mark II sensors in Uganda and Central African Republic, in areas where we have the results-based contracts, and then we'll see, to what extent does that, provide that verification piece, and then what are the economics of that? Can a service provider look at the cost of that technology and the opportunity of a results-based contract, and then say yes, it makes sense to invest in this. Also looking at some simpler data logging technologies. So the type of thing that can just sit in a hand pump for months and months and collect data that you go and pick up later at a much lower cost. Certainly still a work in progress. I'd say what we've got now, certainly for the hand pumps as well, is just that specification. So as an engineer, it's like, what's the minimum spec? And then you can fit all sorts of solutions into that once you know what you need. But if you're doing interesting work in this field, or you have a technology you think I haven't heard of, let me know.
Thanks, Duncan. That's one of the issues of being on the cutting edge, I guess, is you're open to new suggestions coming in all the time. Appreciate that. Nice comment there from Yadav Mainali about experience in Nepal showing the need for results-based contracts to support funding models, which supports a lot of what you've been saying. And a question from Adrian Denier, which links with another earlier question on the Sphere standards recommendation that only 5% or less of household income be spent on buying water. This links to another question on how are water tariffs calculated and agreed upon with end users. So could you, and appreciate the huge variation in this, but could you talk a bit about that issue of how much people are paying for water and how that is actually calculated?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I'll confess that the affordability, these nuances of percentages is not my personal area of expertise, but colleagues at Oxford and work with Guy Hutton at UNICEF are doing some really interesting work in this space. But there's two key points I'd like to highlight. First is that these service providers operate, under the purview of government and the service authorities. So in order to charge a tariff at some level, it needs to the approval of these authorities who often do look at services that are charging, for rural communities for services. And wanting to make sure that there aren't outsized profits coming from this, making sure that it's reasonable. So when I was at WAVE, we spent a lot of time working with government on setting an acceptable rate that was, it would be acceptable to the community and to government as sort of an overseer of that. So that's one piece on tariff setting. The other thing is that if we remember back to the financial performance, users were paying about $300,000 for the services, and that's 1.2 million people. So you're talking about a household cost of less than $1 per person per year. And so if you look at it in that context, it's that's still an aggregate figure. You do need to check this, in each context, and then within communities, how are communities making provision for the most vulnerable households within there to make sure that there's equity. Those issues get a lot more complicated, but at a sort of high level, the government authority and just the overall affordability of the service, I think it go a long ways towards addressing this issue.
Thanks, Duncan. And just take a moment to appreciate that sobering figure of only $1 per person per year can make such a difference in terms of assurance of rural water supply, particularly when backed by contracts type investment of the sort that you've been describing. Interesting question here from Rado on the size of the service providers in the different projects. And one of the main challenges that Rado's been facing is that there are no trusted companies that can actually invest and manage. Do you find that to be a challenge in the different countries that you're working in? In other words, do you find it difficult to find these big, trustworthy and capable companies who can do the implementation?
Right, and I think the answer is a little bit yes. After doing this survey with Reach and RWSN, there's a smaller group out there than I expected who sort of meet some of these eligibility criteria. I mean, the way we started this project was it was a coalition of the willing. We knew service providers who were fairly large and doing good work, and so we got together, and that was the entry point rather than choosing a specific country and then trying to find someone within that. So we've sort of gone at it the other way to try and find where are these services and then trying to support them. But then from there, realizing that there isn't a trusted company or a big established organization in all of these areas that can deliver. And that's led to some of our questions around government. So for example, could we work with subnational regional governments or a national government to then create the space that would that a new service provider could move into? Create the institutional structures, the results-based contracts, where then someone could say, oh, now I see an opportunity to do this type of work, whereas before it was, difficult and I would definitely lose money. Now I can see a way where I could deliver this, and then to not quite create, but to incubate some of those services by working on the environment around them, not just who's already doing the work.
Thanks, Duncan. And I'm afraid to say we're getting close to the end of time here, and I'm going to amalgamate one more question together from a couple of the very interesting ones that have come in there. But I want to say to all of the attendees today, please don't stop putting questions in that Q&A box. We will be emailing them to Duncan for him to answer, and we will be sharing all of the answers to all of the questions that you've asked after the webinar. So don't let that put you off. Please put any questions in the Q&A box. We will get to them. So Duncan, this last question just to ask you, which is from an anonymous attendee, and it's around the kind of institutional model of these funding and management organizations. And the question really is, it seems that the particular model will require ongoing involvement with the water service, whereas in other cases, there's only grant funding to enable the construction of the water service and the training and establishment of a water users or management committee or other structure, and then handover. And the question is around it would be good to have an idea of the costs involved in managing this process for an international NGO and the time frame you're anticipating data being collected over. So really what we're getting to here is of the different institutional organizational models for running these rural water supply services, are there others that you think are valid or interesting? And in what ways have you found that what are the attributes of your one that make it the one to go for? If that's not a bit too much of a mouthful there.
Yeah, I'll do my best, but I'd also encourage this person to send me an email because it sounds interesting. And if you want to talk costs, it depends on context and how big, right? So yeah, we can talk more details on that. I think one of the things we're exploring is to what extent could the results-based contract piggyback on some of these existing project cycles, where perhaps there's been, as is described here, infrastructure's been built, there's been training, a service provider's been set up or incubated, the project winds down. Is there a way for that service provider to then be supported by the results-based model beyond there, and at a much lower cost than running a full-scale project? And so it could be so that there may well be a recurring resource need, but at a fraction of the cost, and in a way that's that's efficient to manage. It doesn't require a country office and all the trimmings. So it's something that we're exploring in a couple of areas. Again, with this idea of how can we take what we've developed and just make it available to elsewhere. And I mean, fundamentally, there's still the moral hazard, right? If there's a recurring funding need and the project ends and the funding dries up, does everything grind to a halt? That's the risk. However, if we can show there's a compelling, cost-effective, transparent, data-driven way to keep the impact going and keep the service developing, and maybe to a point where it eventually no longer needs a subsidy, if that opportunity exists, can we attract resources for that specifically? I think so, but we have to. But as I said earlier, it's easy to sit at your desk and say this looks good. It's another thing to go out and do it. But I'm happy to talk about that more if you see opportunities for how this could fit with pieces you're working on.
Right, Duncan, thank you so much, and congratulations again on this really innovative work that you're doing. And as I said, you're at the cutting edge in a lot of ways, and all strength to your arm in it going forward. Thank you very much, and I sincerely apologize to anybody whose question we didn't get to in the session. Don't worry, we will be getting to your questions and answering them. Please put any further questions that you might have in the Q&A box. There's still time. We've just got a minute or two to go until we conclude the webinar. And we have a couple of exit polls that we'd be really interested in the results of, if you wouldn't mind filling them out for us. First question there, in your area, what are the main challenges related to covering costs in rural water supply schemes? That's the first question. And the second question is, did you find the content of this webinar relevant to your work? So we'd be really, really grateful if you'd take a second or two just to fill in those polls as we close. And I'd also like to say we'll be sending out the recording of the webinar and the webinar PowerPoint slides to all of the attendees today. So you'll be receiving those. And we'll also have a document with Duncan's answers to your questions in the Q&A box as well. So those are on their way to you. And I'd also like to say that we have our next webinar in the O&M series, which will be on systems-based approaches to water service delivery, and that'll be by Liz Jordan of DAI, and it'll be in 2 weeks on October 5. So we look forward to seeing you there to carry on this really interesting conversation. So thanks again to Duncan, and thank you all for attending this. Interesting results of the polls coming in there, and in terms of the main challenges there, a combination of these things, not surprisingly, combination of issues seem to be the key thing, but also difficulties with paying for services, as Duncan has pointed out in his talk. And the results of the second poll question there, did we find the content of the webinar relevant? I'm glad to say that 2/3 of people said very likely that it was relevant, and the other third roughly likely. So thank you very much all for attending, and we look forward to seeing the next O&M webinar. Don't forget to ask Duncan any questions by email, and go to the UPTIME website to have a look at the work that they've been doing. Finally, thank you very much to our tech support, Suzanne Barakis, and to the very capable French translation. That is no easy task. We really appreciate that, Dan. We'll see you all next time. Thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.